I actually bought that today. I bought Far Beyond Driven on vinyl and Dr. Feelgood. My wife was actually like, do you have Dr. Feelgood? And I go, I don't actually. I have pretty much everything else. And I go, it's $6. And I was like, is this an original pressing? Because it was in really good shape. And it was. And I was like, cool, I'm going to buy this. All my Motley Crue is the original pressings. So I've done pretty good at finding not beat to shit versions.
And if you've done a good job not finding beat to shit versions, then you are ready for this episode of Discography Discussion.
You nailed it, dude.
Fuck.
I think you did pretty good. Now you suck.
I am Joe. That is Dan. That is Jon Beatty of Jons Untitled podcast. And God help me, I'm going to get through this show before I completely lose my voice.
We just want to take a special moment to commemorate Joe's voice. It's gone. We appreciate that he's trying to nail it anyway.
I will do what I can until I can do no more.
Well, gentlemen, tonight we're talking about As I Lay Dying. Oh, wait, no, hold on. We're talking about Lamb of God.
Other criminals in the metalcore scene.
Oh, we're talking about metalcore again. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. We talk about a lot of metalcore on the show. Deal with it. I don't know if it's metalcore, but we'll get into that. Lamb of God is one of those interesting bands that got really, really popular in the early to mid 2000s. And I can't quite put my finger on why, as I almost felt as if they were a little bit too extreme, especially on those early albums, to really catch that mainstream appeal.
Well, before we start talking about the 11th hour, I want to take this time to say thank you to everyone for listening to the podcast. Thank you for listening and for subscribing. If you are not a subscriber, you can find everything Discography Discussion at discussmetal.com. We are on Google Play, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, so if you have an Amazon Echo or a Google Home, you have no excuse. Ask it to play the latest episode of the Discography Discussion podcast, and it will. We're also on Facebook and on Twitter at discussmetal. Be sure to like, favorite, and subscribe. It really helps us out. It lets us know you're listening. And now Dan is going to tell you all about 5-star reviews.
We love 5-star reviews here on Discography Discussion. And if you leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Facebook, we will read that review on the show. Keep them coming, guys. We really appreciate it.
And now, once again, Jon is going to tell us all about Jons Untitled podcast.
It'll take a second. Usually you guys are so much more professional than me.
Dude, it's been a fucking week.
It's been a week, man. That's all I have to say.
No, it's fine.
It's been downhill since Wednesday.
There's a bad name.
I'm writing it down.
Well, for those of you who may not have heard me talk about my podcast the previous 2 times I was on with the As I Lay Dying episode on here, go back, listen to that, all 4 hours of it. But basically, it is a podcast where I talk to a lot of musicians in the hardcore metal vein about a lot of different things, and it's a good time. And yeah, I think if you guys are a fan of this podcast, which obviously you are because you're listening to it, head over to my podcast and maybe even start with the episode I had Dan on with Adam from Hopesfall, and then go back and listen to this podcast with the Hopesfall episode. And then I had Dan and Geoff on recently talking all things louder than life. So if you would like a very incestuous back and forth relationship between Discography Discussion and my podcast, you can find me on basically most of the things that Joe already said. You can find me on SoundCloud, iTunes, Stitcher. I'm not on Google Play that I know of. Submitted to Spotify, but I'm still waiting on that. And you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Jons Untitled Podcast, Twitter at Jons Untitled Pod, and a website's coming soon, which no one probably will give a fuck about. But
right now you can go to pornhub.com/Jons Untitled Podcast.
Or the short link for that is Ladyboys. That's where you'll find me.
Perfection.
So, Dan, tell me about Lamb of God.
Lamb of God is a groove metal band. That's right, I said it. That
It's a hot take right out the gate.
Rose to popularity in the early to mid 2000s, although they had been a band since the 90s, under the moniker of Burn the Priest. Very subtle. It's like a good Christian band, right? Right, Joe? That's all we talk about on this show, right, is Christian bands?
That's what people keep saying, even though it's entirely not true.
Oh, well. Lamb of God was a band that was concerned, at least early on, with brutalizing the shit out of your ears with as much of an audio assault as they could muster. Now, that being said, I think Lamb of God was a band that understood that people like to buy records that are memorable and did eventually fit that dynamic. So we're going to start this shindig off with the Burn the Priest self-titled album from 1999.
Jesus.
Is nowhere on that record.
I've listened to this record a few times. I did not enjoy it. But I can definitely tell this is where Lamb of God came from.
I listened to this 3 or 4 times this week because I was trying really, really, really hard to find that spark. I was trying to find that, like, this is how we got a record deal and this is how he rose to popularity. And I don't really see it on Burn the Priest. Randy Blythe, despite being probably one of the most prolific metal vocalists out now. I mean, you get Randy Blythe to guest on one of your songs. Dude, that's like having Jon from Jons Untitled podcast guest on your podcast. It is a big deal, okay? So, let's just say that back in the Burn the Priest days, Randy's screaming and growling, or as I'm going to call them, chipmunk vocals, don't sound overly good on Burn the Priest. Now, this record is hard to categorize. I know we like to categorize things. I want to say musically it's mostly death metal. Very Americanized death metal with a lot of thrash, a little bit of groove in there. I'm not going to say metalcore because this doesn't sound like As I Lay Dying. But this is definitely, there's some hardcore influence in there. The early Lamb of God records are really hard to categorize because I think that they were doing their own original thing. But the only problem with the stuff on Burn the Priest was that it just wasn't overly memorable. I did find the riffs to be enjoyable for the most part. Kind of the punchy time signatures were kind of cool to hear. You didn't have as much groove in there as you do later on in their career. But Burn the Priest is just an extremely heavy record with subpar vocals, and the songs kind of go nowhere, if that makes sense. And I have a lot of trouble believing that this was going to become Lamb of God as we know them now, as being, you know, the ticket seller, sold out arena, pushing fans off the stage kind of band that they became. So I don't know if anybody else listened to Burn the Priest or not, but
to me, when I was listening to this, I thought clearly this was the group of guys that got together and didn't really know what they wanted to do yet. There's nothing memorable about it. The songs run together. The riffs are borderline generic. But I don't think this is an album that they could have avoided making. This is, we wrote a bunch of songs. We recorded them as best we could. We played a few shows. We got better over time. But I don't hear why we had to change our name to Lamb of God.
Well, I think that Burn the Priest, you know, people might have gotten the impression that the band was super satanic or something. And typically, you know, parents don't let their kids buy records by satanic bands. I'm not sure who Deicide sold all their records to, but, you know, it was a different time. So
look at all those albums that Ghost are selling.
Right. Well, I think that the name Lamb of God is a little bit looser in terminology, and they actually make fun of that later on in their career when they put out the video for Redneck, where these parents are like trying to book a live band for their kid's birthday party, and they find a band called Lamb of God, and it's Lamb of God, and very much not what the parents were expecting. And so I think that Lamb of God was a little bit more of like you not really being able to categorize what the band's going to sound like just based on the name. I think Lamb of God was a better name than Burn the Priest any day of the week.
It's always interesting when going back through a band's discography and including either the band that they used to be, so in this situation, Burn the Priest, or, you know, you go back through and sometimes you're able to find like Stain's first record, Tormented, before they got signed, the album that supposedly pissed off Fred Durst to where he thought they were a satanic band based on the imagery on the album artwork alone. And I have a lot of times it's kind of hard because I feel like very much like Dan said, where it's like you listen to this record and you're like, I don't see why you guys got signed. There's nothing here that's so spectacular or not being done better by somebody else by your contemporaries. But I think the thing is maybe the thing that we're not able to look at now in 2018 versus being back in like the late 90s is what the band was doing live in the scene that they were in the Richmond scene. Maybe they were a force to be reckoned with live, and they were a band that a lot of people took notice of, and that's what they built their name on, was more their live thing as opposed to being a great sounding band on record.
That's entirely possible. I mean, and I'm pretty sure that the Burn the Priest album is probably made up of several demos.
Well, I thought they also had said that it wasn't completely the band as it is now once it was Lamb of God. I thought there was a different guitar player or something, or maybe a bass player.
That's possible. I didn't really look into that when I was going through there, but I don't know if you could chalk it up though to it being a difference in guitar player or bass player. This is very much like really straight ahead. I mean, in 1999 you had metalcore was just starting to bloom. Like, it was like metalcore was just planted at that point, at least like what we know of it now. I'm not talking like the early metalcore like Shai Hulud and Earth Crisis and stuff like that, but like I'm talking like the, you know, you had your bands like, you know, Embodiment and Converge and
As I Lay Dying.
Living. No, they weren't around in. Well, maybe they were. No, I don't think they were around in '99.
Not yet.
But the thing is that like you had that metalcore scene was kind of starting to bloom, but Lamb of God did not. They were not on that bandwagon. They were very much trying to do their own thing. It's just that their own thing wasn't quite as compelling at that time. And so the Burn the Priest record is really kind of just an interesting artifact in that, like, I think a lot of people, when they heard of Lamb, because like most people heard of Lamb of God off of As the Palaces Burn, you know, or maybe New American Gospel. But like if you're getting into Lamb of God for the first time, you find out, you know, oh, they used to be called Burn the Priest. There's this whole other Lamb of God album hiding in there, you know, so I'm going to go check this out. And then you listen to it and you're like, oh, fuck, I'm just going to stick with my Lamb of God releases. Because
but I think, to be fair, I thought that the Burn the Priest stuff wasn't available as readily available until way, like probably around Sacrament era, that you could really find it, because the internet not being what it is now, and maybe to the band's advantage, you couldn't find old records like that. Like, I remember when I finally found a copy of Atreyu's Visions, their first record, and that is a piece of shit. Like, I'll just be flat out honest. What I hear from Visions to Fractures in the Facade of Your Porcelain Beauty to even what would become, because half of that record became Suicide Notes and Butterfly Kisses, but when you go back to Visions and you expect to hear the Atreyu that you came to know and love, and you don't get that, it's like, what a letdown. But you have to then kind of look back at it with sort of the revisionist history of being like, well, to be fair, this is a very young band. It's probably their first recording. So is it really fair to judge what they later became as the entity when they kind of went more quote unquote mainstream? And I think in the example of Burn the Priest, that's not entirely fair, because obviously with New American Gospel being the first thing as Lamb of God, obviously they rebranded for a reason. Maybe outside of just even being, you know, the bad name or the name not being favorable. But the fact that they're like, hey, like, that was what we were doing then. We're more proficient at what we do. We know what we want to do now. And that this is a new start all across the board. And I think for us fans to kind of go back and find some of this older material, I think it kind of is a disservice, because then it's doing exactly what we're talking about now, where you're like, well, this wasn't good, and why did they get signed? Because I don't like this. But you're comparing it to what they would become, not what they were at the time. Like, you're not growing. We're not talking about it in the present time of them going from this to Lamb of God's New American Gospel.
Well, you're right. It's not fair. So let's criticize New American Gospel.
I can get behind that.
Because this record is essentially Burn the Priest Part 2.
I think it's got better songs, and I think it
does have better songs.
And I think it has more, I think, it's something, and if you didn't get this from when we did the As Lay Dying thing, I'm kind of a stickler for, especially going back and listening to stuff, having the hindsight to be able to do such. There's always a song that, whether you realize it in present time or looking back, there's always a couple of the songs on a record where it kind of points to where the band's going. And I definitely think songs like Black Label, which, that's a fucking phenomenal album opener. And actually, to answer a question you asked earlier, Dan, of how did this band reach, the success levels that they got to, does anyone remember Ozfest's website showing the band playing Black Label at Ozfest and showing the Wall of Death?
I remember the first time I saw anything about the Wall of Death was at a Lamb of God, so it's probably what you're referencing. I just don't remember specifically where I saw it. And but yeah, that was a big deal to have that kind of exposure, especially back then in 2000. People that are on the Ozfest website are like, man, is Power Man 5000 going to be on the... You know what I mean? Like, it was not...
It was new metal still.
Yeah, nobody was going into into it thinking like, oh, well, what is this? And so to hear a band like Lamb of God, this shit had to have sounded like Nile. You know what I mean? Like, in comparison to what most of the people were listening to. So I think there's a little bit of that spark, because like, I always joke that like the best breeding ground for extreme metal fans are Slipknot fans from the early 2000s, where you can tell that them being a fan of the heavier new metal bands, like your Slipknot and Mudvayne and all that stuff, those guys were clamoring for something that was truly heavy, but just didn't necessarily know about the underground scene or didn't know about, the early metalcore and stuff. So to see something like Lamb of God in 2000, yeah, it had to have been mind-blowing, because like New American Gospel is important of enough record in the sense that it is unabashedly extreme for the demographic that was hearing it. They got the big push, and to be on the Ozfest, even if they were on second stage or whatever, to have that experience to expose people to this, like, no, this is like truly heavy music where we don't make any compromises. We don't add melodic choruses to our songs. We're not trying to get your girlfriend to check our band out either, also, unless she's into that, like, we're not trying to be anything other than what we are, which is just a heavy band that plays technically proficient music. And, we do it so well that you're going to love it. But as far as the actual record goes, like, all the promotion aside, I don't think Randy Blythe's vocals are there yet on New American Gospel. And he didn't have that iconic, deep sound. Like, his vocals later on in their career sound almost unreal. Not like that they sound fake, but they sound unreal. Like, I couldn't do that, the way he does. Everything he was doing prior to... everything he was doing prior to As the Palaces Burn was kind of this like howl with a lot more emphasis on like the higher pitched screams, the higher pitched growls. And I think that sound, as interesting as it may have been in 2000, again, unfair comparison, to my 2018 ears, I'm like, God, these vocals are so pedestrian, like, in comparison to what they would become. And so I think with New American Gospel, it's hard because this is a record that I definitely enjoy more than Burn the Priest. But whenever I listen to it, I enjoy everything I'm hearing while I'm hearing it. But it doesn't stick with me. It's hard for me. Like the Lamb of God became a band that was really good at writing riffs later on. But here on this the first official Lamb of God record, the riffs are good. They're kind of techie sounding. They're heavy, but they don't stick with me. They don't resonate with me. I don't get a lasting impression off of them. And maybe I'd feel differently if I was a kid that only had 5 CDs. But I'm not. I'm a old dude with like 18 trillion CDs. So
you definitely feel different if you were a young guitar player who picked this up to sit alongside, Slipknot and Stained.
Fair enough.
And they definitely had the intensity that those other heavier nu metal bands had, so they were a shoe-in for those fans. Here's the same amount of intensity, just a different style of playing.
It's like hard mode.
Yeah. What's interesting to me, though, is the thing too to remember that that's kind of interesting in talking to people of our age in our early to mid 30s or so, and we got what's maybe sometimes hard in talking to people who didn't grow up when we did is the fact that the internet isn't what it is. There was no iTunes, there was no Spotify, there was not even Pandora or any of that kind of shit.
We had Napster.
I used Kazaa and LimeWire.
Morpheus.
Okay. But the thing that's interesting to me is, when we still bought things and there was still a buzz about a band because of the underground, as Dan was saying, the thing, honestly, how I found out about this band was the Hellfest DVD. And to see a festival with thousands of kids, and you're seeing bands that when they come around, they're playing to maybe 200 people in your town, but you're seeing Dillinger Escape Plan in front of thousands of people, and people are going apeshit. 18 Visions, and Blood Has Been Shed, and Unearth, and Lamb of God. I mean, the fact that I can clearly remember Willie Adler in a Chris Webber Bullets jersey on the Hellfest DVD, and while they're not a nu metal band, basketball jerseys are a total kind of nu metal thing that then segued into kind of the hardcore outfit. But it's interesting to look back and be like, that was sort of the underground groundswell for this band for me, and probably a lot of people who didn't get to see them but saw this amazing band in a live setting, like I was saying earlier, that they were like, fuck, I can kind of get past the tinny production on this record, and I just want to go ape shit during Black Label, or I want to experience Terror and the Hubris in the House of Frank Pollard or whatever. That I think it shouldn't be overlooked that those are different avenues of how this band were able to achieve success while others maybe weren't with this sound. That's
funny. That same Hellfest DVD that I bought when I was on the phone with you the other day at a thrift store. Yeah. Yeah, I've actually was. So it's actually a little fresh in my mind. And, but yeah, no, I get what you're saying though. I mean, everyone was on this DVD, and that was I want to say between 2000 and 2002, there was definitely a push to try to make this heavier, this next level. And I think people are starting to call it the new wave of American heavy metal.
It was totally that East Coast thing between bands like Killswitch. Honestly, a band that I love and I don't think gets enough credit. And I mean, I know we're talking about Lamb of God, but Blood Has Been Shed. I mean, that band, still, you listen to those two records they put out, are just disgustingly heavy.
I have a huge boner for Blood Has Been Shed.
Oh my God.
It's
so good.
Not even appropriate. But yeah, they were so good. They were so heavy.
But the thing is, though, is that East Coast, that Massachusetts, Connecticut, Virginia scene, everyone was they were putting their own stamp, and obviously why it was called the new wave of American heavy metal. Everyone was kind of doing their own thing to it. And Lamb of God were, as you said, on the Burn the Priest stuff, were kind of death metal, sort of techie thrash. They were doing something that wasn't being done. Even if it wasn't as good as any of the influences maybe they had, it was still their own thing. And that's what made it interesting. And I think that's the other reason people were taking note of what they were doing.
Yeah, no, they were. And they, along with all these other bands, really, there was started to be a huge push. I remember I actually just recently pulled out the 2003 Headbangers Ball compilation, which is a 2-disc thing.
Solid, I still have it.
And what's interesting about that compilation is that the first disc is all nu metal. Mostly nu metal. I think Killswitch shows up on disc 1, but...
Was Chimera on the first disc or the second?
Chimera was on the second disc.
Okay.
And it was Down Again. That was the song that was on for Chimera.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what, that is such an interesting compilation because it was almost like... You ever see the movie Star Trek Generations?
Sadly, yes.
Well, that was kind of like a passing the torch kind of movie.
Right.
Where they were passing the torch from the old Star Trek to the Next Generation. That's very much what this 2003 Headbangers Ball compilation was, as far as I could see, because you've got disc one's got
Motograder.
It's got. I thought Motograder was on disc two.
I thought they were on disc one because they were at the tail end of the new metal.
Yeah,
whatever. Joe can look that up.
But I don't think they actually categorized it as that. But that's how it looks overall, plus or minus a couple of bands on each side. But like you had, I think Spineshank was on disc one, Cold was on disc one, Stained was on disc one, Godsmack leads it off, and you had all the Deftones was on there.
Good choice.
Everybody was on there.
Did you just call them Deftoneses?
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I'm drunk. So there was that. And then there was... but then you look at disc 2, and disc 2 is like... starts off with Ruin by Lamb of God. Like, it's like, no, bitches. This is the way it is now. And that I remember that being a really influential song. It's, I bought As the Palaces Burn, immediately after hearing that song. But I mean, it's like Lamb of God, Arch Enemy, In Flames, Chimera, 18 Visions, Devil Driver, Sworn Enemy, 36 Crazy Fists, Demon Hunter, Mastodon, Motograder. That's on disc 2. And then, Poison the Well, Soilwork, Unearth, As I Lay Dying. It's like, yeah, guys, this is, from here on out, this is the way it's going to be. And then a weird Cradle of Filth song is on there, too. But, Mannequin by Cradle of Filth, if you're into that sort of thing.
It's really weird to think back too around that time about how compilations could build a band.
Absolutely.
Because I mean, between the Ozfest Live compilations, the compilation like you're talking about, the Headbangers Balls, I think Hot Topic even used to do compilations as well.
Yeah,
and
they did.
It's really interesting that that's kind of a lost thing.
That was our fucking shuffle.
Now it's a Spotify playlist.
True. It's very true.
Now it's a playlist. It downloaded this playlist, but it was just interesting, that you had that, and I think the promotion on compilations and stuff really kind of like Lamb of God was thrown in a lot of the times with your Killswitch Engage. Your more mainstream
melodic
sounding metalcore bands.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think Lamb of God just kind of got shoot in there, and even though they were extreme, I don't think anything on New American Gospel or As the Palaces Burn is mainstream at all. Like I don't hear it. I don't hear anything. I don't hear any musical decisions that were made with that in mind.
It's weird that you say that though, because I mean, you look at a song like Ruin, and I mean, that's a bona fide hit in metal standards now. You even look at, a song, I'm trying to think of what it is. Is it 11th Hour, I think is the other, like it's a single. And like, that's kind of the weird thing is like you go back and listen to me what the difference between As the Palaces Burn to New American Gospel is I feel like there's more emphasis on actual songs and writing parts that are going to get a crowd interested, and they're thinking, it seems like they're writing more for that, even if they're not, but they're thinking of parts that are memorable.
Right.
And I think that's what separates especially, New American Gospel from As the Palaces Burns and going forward is that they started writing, and I'm always a stickler for this, writing songs that have memorable parts that keep bringing you back. And I mean, for what it's worth, I mean, how many fucking people, there's several YouTube videos dedicated to mimicking the kick drum pattern and that drum fill before the bridge section on Ruin.
Absolutely, yeah. And you're totally right. I mean, As the Palaces Burn was, in my opinion, 3 times the record that New American Gospel was. And that's Absolutely. Just because first of all, that was the first Lamb of God album that I bought. So, of course, it's going to have a little bit more of that nostalgia to it. Because, obviously, in 2003, I didn't have any complaints. Now, I was really into youth group at that time. So, I couldn't tell anybody I had this CD, but I had it. So, the cat's out of the bag.
Such a badass.
I know, right? Oh, my. Everybody stand back. We got a badass in the room. But, this record was so heavy. And I remember it was one of the very first bands that I ever listened to where I was like, holy shit, I can't just pick up a guitar and learn how to play this. Like, this is way above, because I was trying to play guitar at that time. And, like, this is way above my skill level, and I'm like, I'm never going to ever be able to touch it. The drumming on this record is badass. Like, just the pure rhythmic aggression of Lamb of God at this juncture was incredible. And this time the patterns were memorable. Very much like how I feel about Meshuggah or how I feel about Gojira. Like those are bands that aren't necessarily melodic. Like, they're not going to catch you on As the Palaces Burn. They're not going to catch you with a catchy hook.
I would slightly disagree with that. I think songs like Ruin and 11th Hour and a few others, they're going to perfect that and get to those catchy things, but I think this is the groundwork that sets that foundation.
Well, they are hooky. Like, there are hooks that will get stuck in your head, but they're not, what I'm trying to say is they're not the traditional hooks. They're not like the type of hooks that like you would associate with a band that was trying to get radio play.
Now, a fan of Slipknot would latch on to this type of music.
Oh, yeah.
Because they're used to the hook being the extreme outburst.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I meant when I said earlier about how they were in the right market to catch on, because they were different, they were technically proficient, and they had a little bit of classic metal through in at the very end. I personally think that most people will not admit that they listen to Lamb of God to hear Chris playing the drums, because he doesn't sound conventional the way his drums are mixed. Critically speaking, I'm a little picky with him because I've heard him say out of his own mouth he can't do some of the things he does if he's not playing his own kit, which says to me you're gimmicked in some way. But at the same time, if you're able to do it, you're still doing it, even if you have to use training wheels. So I don't really worry about shit like that. He's still a fucking badass, though.
I think something that's interesting to me about Chris is that he's left-handed, but he plays on a standard kit.
It's the old Ringo Starr syndrome.
Except for he's not a background piece like Ringo Starr is.
Right, yeah, he's like almost the entire like skeleton of the band. But yeah, like, I don't know, I guess I don't really have any better way to describe it other than I just really like this album, and I thought it was, in my opinion, the first really good Lamb of God record. And Randy's vocals are finally there.
Getting there.
He does get better after this, but this was the first time where I was like, I can really take this seriously. Because, like, dude, there's some shit on Burn the Priest where he's just like, I don't know, like, little 1 second vocal bursts and shit, like really, like, dumb shit that, like, you shouldn't do as an extreme vocalist. Whereas on As the Palaces Burn, he matches the actual rhythms of the songs better. He's one of the few hard vocalists that actually uses his voice as a percussive instrument, which I really like. And I really liked his tone and just how, like, precise and easy to understand he became.
I think a lot of that, though, is you're looking at a band that's still very young for all intents and purposes, honestly, I feel like New American Gospel is still basically a slightly better sounding demo.
They're like, still Burn the Priest on that record, basically.
Yeah, it's still really raw. I think it was a band that someone signed. I forget who. I think it was Prosthetic signed them, and gave them a little bit of money to, make a new record. But to me, it isn't until you get to a New American Gospel where there's a little bit of money thrown into it. I'm sorry, As Palaces Burn, that has a little bit of money thrown into it. However, I don't know if this is where we want to get into this on, because I want to talk about this for a hot second. And if we want to talk about it later, when it comes up in the timeline, that's fine. But the re-recording and how Devin Townsend handled the recording of this record, that I think kind of is, it's it's a gift and a curse, I think, on how we listen to this record in its initial state. Because if you went back and watched the 10-year documentary on As the Palaces Burns, he went in going like, yeah, I just took the gig. I didn't listen to anything. I didn't really do my homework. And then I showed up and I was like, oh, fuck, like this band, I kind of out of my element here. I wasn't adequately prepared. And then, you know, the hard drive issues when he went to send everything back, and just a lot of the issues surrounding the actual recording of this record. I think they went back and re-recorded this record very quickly because they had to fix what he lost. And so once all of that's been kind of out there, I kind of have looked at this album in a completely different light. And I don't know if either of you two have, in light of all that information.
To be honest with you, I didn't really, I didn't even know that happened. But
this is where my nerdom of watching documentaries and DVDs either is a hindrance or a help.
No, that's okay. I didn't know that. So I guess I don't really have an opinion on it because I just know what we have.
Have you listened to the re-recorded version that Josh Wilbur, who's been doing most of Lamb of God's new stuff, have you listened to that version of As the Palaces Burns?
I have not.
Okay.
I'm still listening to my original CD copy of As the Palaces Burn. We run into this every now and again on the podcast where there's two versions of an album and the differing hosts listen to different versions. So, I don't know. I'll definitely be listening to that re-record on the way home then.
Yeah, there is a 10th anniversary edition which has the re-recorded, remastered. Okay. It's labeled as both versions of the songs. I don't know a whole lot about it other than, yes, Devin Townsend was involved at one point, and I thought that was really strange because wasn't he one of the original guest musicians on one of the songs? And I want to say it's A Devil in God's Country. Or was that just on the remaster that was his only surviving track?
Well, it shows on the re-recording that it's a remix of that. But to be fair, the A Devil in God's Country is on the original version as well. The weird thing is in the documentary of the 10-year anniversary, because they did a documentary about the whole thing. And then obviously it was a big preamble for being, hey, we remix and remastered this record. Here it is. Because some people, I guess, bitched about how shitty As the Palaces Burn sounds, which, it kind of gets into this weird territory of, people falling in love with the record the way it is because of how raw it is and so on and so forth. But then it goes into this whole thing of like, well, when you shine it up and put some new current production on it, does it really make it better, or does it kind of does the sheen of the newness of it kind of take away from what made the songs great in their raw state? And to be honest, I like both versions because, Ruin sounds great, and to hear a modern version of that record stacked against what would become the rest of the band's discography, recorded and produced and mixed and all that by the same person, it makes it sound more... There's more continuity now with that record being redone. However, I remember, like Dan was saying, this was the first record I bought of the band's when it first came out, because Ruin was so good and so hooky for me that when I went and bought this record, I still have memories attached to this record as it sounds in its original state. So it's kind of a little bit hard to say I like one over the other, because I think they're both great for what they are and what they offer. But I didn't know if either of you two had watched that documentary when it had first come out a while ago, or if you really had listened to both versions of the records to be able to kind of break those down a little bit between the two.
Sometimes bands do re-records. I know Motorhead re-recorded Ace of Spades. And is it better? Do I care? Look at this. I have two versions of Ace of Spades. I don't feel like, and again, I haven't listened to it, but I don't feel like a re-record ever makes something better. Just taking the same songs and putting modern production on it, that can make it better if you had a good source and it was just mixed badly. But nothing in me wants to hear a remixed Def Leppard Photograph. I don't want to hear that. I don't need British Steel to be remastered to enjoy it better. But a good comparison that I know Dan can comment on is the re-recorded All Else Failed by Zayo better than the original?
No. First of all, it doesn't have all the same tracks. So, like, that's a huge fucking mistake. It only has 8 songs versus the original's 10 songs. Secondly, no, it's not even made by the same members of the band that recorded the first All Else Failed. So, like, it was a cash grab record. They've made no bones about that.
So why did Lamb of God have to re-record?
Well, I'm not
their seminal
necessarily
record?
I'm not necessarily sure they had to re-record the whole thing. I think there's just like little fill-in spots that needed to be re-recorded.
Because as I would, to point to that, I believe the whole thing was that, like I said, Devin Townsend lost chunks of the record, and so I think they, at the time of them recording the record, the band had to come back in and basically re-record the parts of the songs that were lost. And then I think on this remaster remix of the record, I think maybe they came in and maybe redid some pieces, not entire songs.
Okay. Yeah, I'm glad to have that clarity there because I wasn't sure.
Come clarity?
No. Don't trigger me. Get it?
They like triggers.
Get it?
Oh, I get it.
But
hey, when we connect all these clouds, I think you're going to get a really great representation.
John, I'm getting really tired of running your gesture race here. So,
hey, Clayman, shut up.
Yeah, whatever. So,
refuse, resist. Wrong band.
Wrong band. So,
better off dead.
So then in 2004, they released an album called Ashes of the Wake.
That was about the critical reception they got to.
My personal opinion, not as good as the Palaces Burn.
Really?
Yeah. I still like it. Like, when it came out, I was like, this is pretty cool. But whenever I listened to it back this time around, I was kind of like, okay, there's a few things about it that sound good. Like, I mean, no, okay, let me rephrase that. This is a great record. Okay.
Oh, okay.
But I personally enjoyed As the Palaces Burn more. Maybe because it was a little bit less clean. Maybe because it was a little grittier. I don't know. It's hard to explain what year was this? 2004. So I would have been
2004. Yep.
Yeah. So I would have been like, what? How old am I now? Like 65. So subtract. I'll carry the 1. No. Okay. So I was in high school. So I was like 16, 17 or something when this came out.
In 2004?
I graduated from high school in 2004.
Oh God. I didn't know I was older than you.
Yeah. So you're like, what, 73? Shit, yeah. I guess that makes Geoff like 94. Fuck. Okay. So, anyway. Ashes of the Wake was cleaner. It was punchier. I did notice on my sound system that this is the first Lamb of God album that like really kicked my sound system's ass. Like, this thing really was pummeling. The drums definitely have like a lot more like oomph to them. The song, I feel like the song structures or the pace of the songs are a little bit slower. Like, this is whenever they kind of started slowing down and letting the music breathe a little bit instead of it being like it was before. It's like the first person to get to the end of the song first wins. You know, like this was definitely more of they took the aspects of As the Palaces Burn that worked and made an entire like record out of just those like catchier, hookier parts. Because at this point, they are finally at, I wouldn't say the height of their career, but like more popular than they had ever been. Like, there's more people showing up in Lamb of God shows in 2004 than there has ever been. And at this point, when you've got 1, 2, 3, technically 4 albums out in that vein, by 2004, nobody was listening to nu metal. So a band like Lamb of God was actually at this point kind of almost feeling a little nostalgic for people that had just gotten into them back in the New American Gospel days. And I know it's only 4 years, but when you're a high schooler, that's like forever ago. So they're basically considered to be like cream of the crop as far as metal bands go in that era. And again, this is actually pretty unique because there weren't a lot of bands out in 2004 that sounded like Lamb of God. They definitely had their own sound, and it wasn't widely copied. Like you look at bands like As I Lay Dying and Killswitch, where like literally every band that came out after those bands debuted wanted to sound like those bands. Lamb of God was kind of the exception. Like you listen to metalcore over here, and then you listen to Lamb of God over here, because I don't personally still think that they're metalcore at this point.
I don't think they ever were.
I don't think you could ever call them that.
No.
They play a lot of shows with metalcore bands. It's kind of like how Roach Coach is doing that, like, Who's the Papa thing right now, where they're like, trying to decide who was a direct influencer of nu metal versus who was just associated. So I'm going to say that Lamb of God was associated with metalcore, but they were not, in fact, part of the club.
No.
There's two styles of metalcore. There's the hardcore influenced and the heavy metal influenced. We've said East Coast, West Coast. I think of it as I Lay Dying, Killswitch Engage, or Under Oath. Lamb of God had thrash metal and technical drumming and overall technical playing, which was very common in Gothenburg bands that influenced metalcore later. So yeah, you showed up to the party and you already had half the costume on, so everybody just thought you belonged there. It's like showing up with a black t-shirt and just walking in, and everybody thinks you're a security guy, so they don't stop you.
We're going to talk later about security guys not stopping people.
Oh,
Anyway,
shit. I'm sorry, dude. I'm sorry.
So
I'm going to go back to not speaking.
Well, Ashes of the Wake is a great record, but for me personally, I think at this point, I'd heard New American Gospel, I'd heard As the Palaces Burn. Ashes of the Wake was very much just more of that, and I kind of started feeling like the band, yes, they were progressing in their sound, but I guess at that point, I was just kind of getting a little bit like, okay, are you guys going to always sound like this? Or is there going to be, some sort of change? I think I would have been fine with it either way. But I, kind of like there was a little bit of a spark of music reviewer in me that's like, okay, well, what else you got? Oh, okay, more of this shit? Okay, well, it's still good. There's nothing wrong with it. It's like I'm trying really hard to be critical. There's nothing wrong with Ashes of the Wake. It's just that, I'm basically 4 albums in now, and I've got the same experience overall, except, obviously this is better than Burn the Priest, but like, I've gotten the same experience overall now with 3 albums, and I'm kind of like, okay, what are they going to do next? Are they going to go heavier? Are they going to go softer? Are they going to turn into Pantera? It's definitely one of those questions, that was in my mind at that time when I was trying to be critical. But there's not a whole lot to be critical about on this record, to be totally honest.
I think the thing for me, though, looking at this record when it came out and even now, you look at the first 6 songs. I don't know if this is an example of a band front-loading a record with all the bangers right away to where you're just like, holy shit. But it's like...
Blew your load at the beginning of the record, yeah.
Yeah, but and kind of speaking a little bit to what Joe was saying just a little bit ago about, like they had a little bit of the nu metal influences, but were kind of more in the vein of like the Gothenburg song. You have a song on here like Ashes of the Wake with Chris Poland and what's his face from Megadeth, basically trading off solos.
That's
that's kind of like like a cosign right there, but they're kind of doing this weird Ministry-esque kind of thing with like taking political sound bites and throwing it over the music that they're putting together. I don't know if anyone ever put that correlation to that song, but I've always thought it has a little bit of a Ministry lean to it.
Yeah, I can hear that.
But shit. If you were to go to a Lamb of God show now and you're like, okay, they're playing Laid to Rest, Hourglass, Now You Got Something to Die For, Faded Line, No Murder, and Blood of the Scribe, most people are probably gonna be like, fuck yeah, bring that on, more of it, please.
Yeah.
And I think that's an attestment to like this album. Yeah, it lost a little bit of its rawness and is more polished overall, but I think as a whole you're starting to see, and I'll probably talk more about this on the next record when we get to Sacrament, but one of Mark Morton's bigger influences that he said is Beatles, because he likes song structures. He likes songs, not parts, songs. And so I think you're starting to see some of the individual members start writing what they like, and you're starting to kind of see like, oh, Mark likes to write these kind of songs, Willie's kind of like, you're starting to see more of a definition of all the individual members and what they do and bring to the band as a whole. And this is the record where I really started noticing that. And it's really interesting too. Like, Randy is getting a little bit better. He gets better every record as we go, and sometimes that's not always something we see with a lot of bands, that as you keep going, everybody's progressing and doing something, especially the vocalist, adding new nuances to what they do. It's usually like you've been saying, like, that's more of the same. I'm used to this. Now what?
Yeah, and he added like talking parts and, a lot of that stuff. And I thought that it was just really cool to hear him progress. And like, one of the things I like about Randy Blythe's vocals the most is that he's really easy to understand for a metal vocalist. Like, it's so easy to take the vocals in a full rasp direction, or go ultra deep guttural. And he does do a pretty good deep guttural voice, but for whatever reason, when he enunciates so well, you could pretty much pick up the lyrical content just by listening to it. You don't have to like pull out the lyric sheet all the time. I mean, it's not like 100% at this point in their career, but a lot of that stuff is going to be fixed on their 2006 album Sacrament.
There we go.
So, John, tell us about Sacrament.
Sacrament, honestly, is probably my favorite Lamb of God record, start to finish. And I don't know if that's a bold statement or a common sentiment with Lamb of God fans. To me, the band, and I know a lot of times on your podcast you guys don't really necessarily get into production per se or who they're working with, but this is a record, after watching the documentary that came along with it, where I think working with Machine, who had done the Gutter Phenomenon by E-Tid and a lot of like kind of seminal records for a lot of bands, and kind of helping a band find their sound and kind of defining it. I think this redefined what Lamb of God was for a lot of people in the traditional metal scene at that point. I think it separated them as far as the songs. Like, you have a song like Redneck, which is an undeniable crossover hit. I don't that we would disagree with that. Like, it is a song that took them into the mainstream where they had never had a song like that before.
Yeah, I mean, this record was so different that it could be polarizing, because like I was saying on the previous record, that like, okay guys, you've got 4 albums and you're doing the same shit again. This was not the case on Sacrament. This was, okay guys, you guys want to hear the new shit? And there's so much more melodic lead guitar work going on this record than we've ever had on a Lamb of God release. And I really appreciated that. The melodies, the songs are hooky again, or not really again, but like for the first time, hooky in a way where like you actually have like semblances of real choruses, and you have really cool parts that are repeated. Like we complain a lot about bands that will play something really cool for 15 seconds and then never play it again. Lamb of God really, they had to, they had to have been working with somebody phenomenal, because it really redefined the Lamb of God sound for the rest of their career. Now, let's travel back to 2006, the first time I heard Redneck.
Ladies and gentlemen, 2006 Dan.
Oh my God! Did you guys hear that new Zayo record? Anyway, so it's kind of like it's kind of like 2018, Dan. Anyway, so what's interesting about Redneck is that like I was not expecting this. I really hadn't been that up and up on Lamb of God in a while. So
Did this feel like a Mudvayne situation to you with
this
Determined?
Was weird to me. Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, because like Walk With Me in Hell, like it's a banger, but like Redneck, in light of recent events, I am not going to go full on anti-Pantera mode. I was very taken aback by Redneck, because the first time I heard it, I saw the video. I was just up late one night. It was on like Headbangers Ball or Uranium or whatever, was on the TV.
They played this on the Spice Channel?
On the Spice Channel, yeah. Well, I could only watch the Spice Channel, but it was like all distorted. But anyway, You go to channel 91.9 and then press up on the TV remote. Anyway, so, but no, I saw Redneck and I was like, this is Lamb of God? Like, it's obviously Randy Blythe singing, there's no doubt about it, but, like, I've never heard him singing like this. It's not a clean vocal by any stretch of the imagination, but, like, it was so exactly what it's called, Redneck. Like, they're playing on this giant stage in the suburbs, and, like, there's, like, beer, and, like, I don't know, it's just very weird hearing him just, this is a motherfucking invitation. Like, I'm like, holy shit, Lamb of God just became Pantera. Like, I didn't even see it coming. Like, this is, and at the time, I was like, this is not the same band. This is bullshit. This is just not even close. This is blah, 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 blah. And then I ended up picking the record up for like $5 at Best Buy in like the bargain bin like 3 or 4 years later. And whenever I did finally listen to the entire album and I got to hear that song in context with the rest of what they were doing, I got a much better idea of what they were doing. And I found the majority of the record to be really in a lot of ways much more enjoyable than even, Ashes of the Wake.
All right, so I know Dan and I talked about this earlier this morning. In the documentary that accompanied the Sacrament album, contrary maybe to what Dan might have thought, the band, when they showcased the band working on what would become Sacrament songs, they showed the working titles of most of the album. This song they referred to as their Cowboys from Hell song. I think the working title was either Cowboys from Hell or Pantera from Hell or something like that. Basically a reference to Pantera.
I'm shocked.
Because they obviously knew that there is a Pantera resemblance. Speaking to the song title of what would become Redneck, they based on the music. Mark Morton said it sounded like breaking a beer bottle in a parking lot.
Oh, yeah. Hell yeah.
No, that's the wrong band. Well, I don't know if I can make that joke anymore.
Yeah, we're living in crazy times.
But yeah, so I mean, you're not wrong with that assumption. The band, even very self-aware, knew that it was a Pantera-esque song.
If that's the case, then I would say Redneck is what it sounds like if Pantera was fronted by Rob Zombie.
Oh, interesting.
Because he's got a little bit more of a Rob Zombie delivery than a Phil Anselmo. Phil Anselmo has a very unique, it's Phil, Rob has this, whatever condition my voice is in today, I'm just going to yell into that microphone as hard as I fucking can. I've said it before on the show. He can't pull it off outdoors. Indoors, he's fine. But even on his records, you can tell, okay, today was an outdoor day. Today was an inside day. Rob, use your inside voice. And I always listen to Redneck and I think, okay, so if we didn't have Damage Plan, if Pantera had gone on with a different vocalist and that vocalist happened to be Rob Zombie, I think this is what it would have sounded like.
I mean, that's not entirely wrong at all. But I don't know if Rob Zombie would have been the first name that came to my mind.
No, he's too much of a control freak.
I got more of a Godsmack vibe from the vocals, to be honest. But obviously that song turned me off, right? Because everybody knows how I am with Pantera and stuff that sounds like Pantera. Luckily for me, that's really kind of the only song on the record that sounds like that, really, But it's great for them because it really, if they weren't a household name before that song, they definitely were now. I mean, this is a song for rednecks. People are going to listen to that song and be like, holy shit, I get a fucking Lamb of God tattoo. I got my Bud Light. Yeah, I get my Lamb of God. Oh, my God, I got to go talk to Billy, who's 2 trailers over. Holy shit, he's going to freak out. This shit is crazy. You need to hear this band's old shit. Now that, man, is some serious fucking heavy metal. There's a place for people like that in the metal scene. But, this record, though, really much more melodic than anything we'd gotten from Lamb of God before. The guitar leads alone are awesome. the band isn't trying to go a million miles a minute. They're actually like trying to really showcase what they've got going on. And they really were able to pull off some pretty good groove on this record. With the exception of Redneck, they pulled off being a heavy groove metal band that didn't necessarily sound like Pantera. They sounded like Lamb of God. Like it was a redefinition, and I think it worked really well for them. And I know this is when the fan base really divided. I think there were a lot of people like me that heard Redneck and were like, "Fuck this band," you know. Like, I think there was a little bit of outrage, but they're playing to a different audience now, or at least to a much wider audience than they ever had before. I think the diehard Lamb of God fans dug it and appreciated it, but you know, anybody that was just there for the Metalcore Association is checked out at that point. And now Lamb of God has moved on to, being a bigger name band that's going to be on your festival, or this really propelled them further into the mainstream than I ever thought would be possible for a band like this.
What was interesting for me around this time was, and I think I made a reference to this on my Esley Dying appearance about having a friend on the Ozfest the year it was free. And this is the year, speaking to what Dan just said, Lamb of God was the band right before Ozzy on this year's Ozfest. This is where it was the free year and all the typical metalcore bands went over to Warped Tour. So you like Esley Dying, your Norma Jeans and so forth went over to that Warped Tour year. It was surreal to see the amount of people who reacted to the band at this point, but not just the band, but this album specifically. When anything off of this record was being played, I dare say it got more of a reaction than some of the more old, tired, and true songs of like your Ruins, your, Now You've Got Something to Die For and so forth. Songs like Blacken the Cursed Sun or Foot to the Throat or whatever, like they had such a huge reaction. And much like Dan was saying, like I think the propensity that the band was showing at this point of writing big songs that had parts that soared, like, Again We Will Rise, like just holy shit. Like I remember when the first time I heard that Randy's like kind of guttural like intro to that song, you're just like, wow, like there's stacked and layered vocals on this. Like this is new.
This
like,
has got a budget.
Yeah, like there's so much shit that's going on this record. And the other thing that I love about Sacrament is the fact that it's a complete record. I think they paid more attention to, like I was just saying on As the Palaces Burn, that where I feel like that was front loaded. The first 6 songs are just kick you in the dick the whole way through, and then you're kind of like, okay, like the rest of it's okay. This, I feel like they paid more attention to their track listing and built a full record that keeps you for the whole time, because by the time you get to like More Time to Kill or Requiem or Beating on Death's Door, like the album closer, it makes you want to just listen back to that record. And to borrow a Roach Coachism, they're very, very cognizant of our time. This is an album that clocks in at like 45 minutes. This is a very easily digestible 11 songs that just makes you want to keep going back and listening to this record over and over. This is why it was Revolver's album of the year, I think, because it's palatable for a heavy metal record, and it offers a little bit of something for everybody.
Yeah, for sure. Like, and to quote Joe, sequencing is important. I've
been saying it for 20 years.
The order in which you play your tracks on a record, making it a complete experience, which is not a popular concept today.
No.
It's all about the single song that you released, or it's all about, just like getting all your songs onto a cool playlist or whatever. It's almost like albums are made now as playlists versus like, okay, does this song lead into this one naturally? Does this sound, because nobody's focusing on the guy that buys the vinyl and is just going to listen to it and can't skip tracks. But like this as a vinyl release would be awesome to listen to from beginning to end, And so Sacrament was really awesome. I listened to this album twice this week when I was doing my preparation, because the first time I heard it, I was like, holy shit, did I like that? Like it really, because honestly, like when I was listening to the earlier stuff, like everything pre-Sacrament, I would like miss entire songs. Like I'd be doing something else, or I'd be like cleaning or driving or something, and like I would miss 2 or 3 songs that would just go by, and I'd hear them in the background. And it's just like, you know, I don't know. I'd have to go back and listen to them again because I was like, oh shit, I missed that song. That was not the case on anything, you know, after Sacrament. You know, like Sacrament was like, I'm not going to miss a song. I'm going to very clearly know when it changes over to the next track. So I thought this was really cool, but I was kind of like, what else you guys got? And then we didn't hear from the band again for 3 years.
I feel like this is the only reason you brought me on. Actually, no, I'm sorry. That happens in a little bit, but still. I think this is a prime example of the music climate that we're in currently, where you don't want to oversaturate anymore. That sometimes going away builds your brand, creates the interest in your band and making people want to hear from you and see you again. And I mean, something I didn't necessarily bring up when we were talking about the first couple records, but the interesting thing too is from As the Palaces Burn to Ashes of the Wake, that was only a year difference.
Right.
And you saw like the growth of the band in just a year. And then it's, you know, they're typically on the, you know, every 2 years, every 3 years cycle, because they're just that popular now, where it's, we got to record a record for a year and then we're touring on it for 2. So it's a 3-year album cycle. But from what I remember around this time, like the band toured Sacrament incessantly. And then they were like, we're done. Like, we're going to go away for a little bit and call, like, you know, when we come back, we're ready. And when we were ready turned into 2009's Wrath. And I mean, I don't know for you, Dan or Joe, where you guys were at as Lamb of God fans at this point, but I remember when picking up this record, like, this is around the time where I tried not to listen to the over saturation of singles and hype around albums anymore, because it just kind of ruined that record experience for me. But I remember when hearing Set to Fail, and I was like, this sounds like the continuation of a band that's trying to grow from what they did and what succeeded on Sacrament and taking it to the next level. And once again, Randy's vocals right out the gate, you're seeing everything that he's learned how to do showcased to perfection.
I can agree with that, especially vocally. The thing that I'm the most, I don't know, that the vocals are the thing I like the most about this record. What I don't like is I kind of feel like some of the riffing, and again, this is just being critical because that's what we do. It's a little bit more Gothenburg. It's a little bit more, but see, Gothenburg's a bad thing in 2009 because people associate Gothenburg with what?
In Flames.
Metalcore. And in 2009, people were starting to be like, if it's not a founding metalcore band, I don't want it. You know, like at that point, the derivatives were starting to be fanned out. But this is not a metalcore record by any stretch, and I'm not trying to make that argument, but it's just that it bothers me because I feel like in 2009, playing a metalcore riff to fill up 30 seconds of space is a cop-out, when I know that this band is capable of doing much better. That being said, this is probably the lightest Lamb of God album that I've heard. This is not punch like all of their previous material did. Individual songs, maybe. But this wasn't, you know, this was not what I was expecting. This was like, okay, we're going a little too slow. We're going a little too melodic. And like, if you're somebody that's jumping on the bandwagon, let's say you hadn't heard Sacrament, you know, somehow. Like, you know,
oh, dude, man, that coma sucked.
Yeah, oh my God.
How long was I in there?
This coma. You know who my favorite band is? Lamb of God. Oh my God, they just put a new record out? Wait, what the fuck is this? I was expecting As the Palaces Burn. You know, like, obviously, those fans were probably already gone on Sacrament anyway. But, like, I think it's just really interesting that I feel like this was their first quote-unquote attempt to do what they had done prior again. I personally don't hear the growth on this. It sounds like they're just doing Sacrament again. And when you're going to call a record Wrath, I don't expect it to be slower and less extreme than an album called Sacrament. You know, like, I don't know, just Wrath. Like, whenever I heard, you know, oh yeah, our new album's going to be called Wrath, it's coming out, you know, I remember being like, okay, cool. And I don't hear a lot of Wrath on this album. I hear a slower version. I mean, obviously, they're still Lamb of God. They are still technically great. You know, Randy's vocals are more varied than they have ever been. But this one just did not connect with me on the level that really all their previous material did.
I think for me, hearing songs like Grace, I don't know that we could have ever heard a song like this without where they were on the album previous. And to me, while I agree, this isn't on the level as Sacrament as far as just being an album as a whole that I really love. Some of the shining moments off of this record, like a Grace, like with the, you know, acoustic interlude kind of thing into what would become the main riff, or, you know, Fake Messiah, like Randy's vocals on that are really fucking good. And I even think, you know, kind of like I was saying about the last couple of records, I think there's some really good songs at the end of this record that kind of make it more enjoyable. They're growers for sure. It takes a little bit of time for the songs to kind of really find their way. But I think like a song like Choke Sermon or Reclamation, I think are really good. And initially when I first gave the album the first few spins, I was like, you know, I'm not really feeling this. Like, it's kind of a letdown. But as I've sat with this record over the last handful of years and kind of gone back to it, I tend to find that there's a lot more in it that I like, that I don't know if it's just me as a listener growing to like the things about it and understanding what they were doing, or if it's more that the songs were good and it just, you know, they knew they were writing good songs. It was just going to take a little bit for the fans to catch up to what they were doing at the time.
The first time I heard it, the last time I heard it, I've thought the same thing. I don't understand why a band that previously had nothing but pedal to the metal, driving songs that have no bullshit. Just the song starts, the song ends. I don't understand why we now have intros and little fake outs. I don't know why they need that. My first thought was, are they trying to do like an Opeth thing, or is this just like we're trying to be a little more creative and a little more atmospheric, and we're playing a joke on the fans where, no, it's still Lamb of God. We're still going to go 117,000 miles per hour. And I don't really... My only complaint is that same old sequencing argument that I have where, yes, at some point I'm going to sit down, I'm going to listen to this album from beginning to end, and all the little interlude-y things are going to matter. But when I buy this and I sit down and I listen to it, once I've heard your trick, I'm not really interested in it anymore. One of my favorite songs, not really... The song's not my favorite, but the fact that this album exists when it did is one of my favorite records. But when Marilyn Manson did Born Villain, or Villain, depending on how you read it, there's a song on there called Pistol Whipped that has a 1.5-minute introduction of just a fucking gun being loaded and cocked and a round being chambered. And then this fucking kick-ass song starts. And I want to know why I still have to listen to that whole thing to get to the song, even though I've heard it. I've heard your artistic expression of that interlude that kind of sets a tone. But once I know the tone, I just want to hear the song. So I don't know why they needed all of that extra bullshit. It's Lamb of God. Just go fast. I'm cool with it.
Well, like I was complaining about, though, you know, whenever we were in the golden era of Lamb of God, your New American Gospel, As the Palaces Burn, Ashes of the Wake. Even then, though, I was complaining because I'm an unpleasable metalhead.
Ladies and gentlemen, unpleasable metalhead.
And if you do the same thing, I get irritated because you're not growing. But then when you grow, I get irritated because it doesn't sound like the old shit. You know, so it's kind of like you're damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of thing. I think my complaint with this, though, is actually very much the same in that, like, Wrath to me sounds like a kind of a watered down version of what we had on Sacrament, which is something that I would have expected if this record had come out in 2007, or 2008. Like, I would have been like, okay, well, they're just doing the same thing again, and they're capitalizing off of the success of Wrath, of Sacrament, and I think, there's nothing technically wrong with it, but I just don't really, I don't know, just didn't connect with me. It's not shit. I mean, none of their albums are shit. I could say that confidently.
So the interesting thing, too, is that even at Lamb of God's quote-unquote worst, they're still better than most people's best.
I agree. Yeah, absolutely. It's like we said about Il Nino. There's something about Lamb of God, especially at this point in their career, that they are instantly listenable. I think you could be a metalhead from all walks of life and pick up a record like Sacrament or pick up a record like Wrath and enjoy it. And even if you're not into extreme metal, that could actually work as a gateway, especially if you work your way backwards in Lamb of God's career. You go from like the kind of extreme, you get all the way back to New American Gospel, which is arguably as extreme as they got. So it works both ways. I think people that are diehard metal fans and only listen to death metal stopped listening to Lamb of God, once they grew their first, navel hair. So like it's one of those catch-22s where it's like, which Lamb of God do you want? Do you want this one that's instantly easy to just latch onto and listen to, or do you want just brutal? Because this is a band that actually is willing to give you both. Especially if you go see them live. To see the mix of these old songs and the new songs mixed together, it creates a really interesting dynamic that I think works really well for the band in a live setting. So before we go on to the next record, let's talk about stuff that happens in live settings.
I think you're slightly too early for that still.
I'm not. The concert in question was in 2010.
Okay.
Which was prior to the release of their album Resolution.
We
might have to do some.
Nope, because according to all of this, Sturm und Drang was the last record, and it was the first record that Randy had written since all that shit happened. Because there's songs about it on Sturm und Drang, like 512, which is a reference to the prison stuff. So
well, let's get this out of the way real quick.
We're just gonna go there. We're gonna talk about it.
Yeah, because I'm talking about when the actual event took place, not when he was arrested.
Okay.
So basically what happened is in Prague, there was a concert, a Lamb of God show.
I'm pulling a Daniel Terry. I'm bringing stuff for show and tell.
You got the goddamn book out. Wow. Okay.
Hardcover, too.
Oh, damn. Is it signed?
Jeez, that's first pressing.
Tell me it's signed by Randy Blythe. Tell me it
is. Not yet.
Okay. Well, let me just call him up, with all of my discography discussion connections, and we'll get him on the show.
Oh, thank God you called.
Oh, yeah, so I heard you were talking shit about how I sound like a Pantera ripoff.
Yep, that was me.
I'm pretty sure I said you sounded like Rob Zombie, sir.
He's like, I already forwarded everything you said to Phil. He's heading to your house right now. So, bring it on. So, there is, there was a concert in Prague where Lamb of God is a heavy band. What kind of things do you guys see at heavy shows?
Lots of undercover smoking.
Yeah, they're thrashing around. They're playing their shit. Vocalist looks pissed because that's part of the deal. People jumping up on stage, jumping off the stage into the crowd.
AKA me.
Happens all the time. At this particular show, a fan had jumped up on the stage. Well, there was one guy, a different guy, that jumped up 2 times. He jumped up once and then jumped off. Then he jumped up again, and instead of jumping off immediately, he decided to try to give Randy a hug while he was playing on stage.
Wouldn't you?
Randy's not into it because, for whatever reason, he kind of we live in a world now where you kind of can't just let people up on stage. Not when you're a big name profile band like Lamb of God. They've reached a level now where this isn't like your local punk club and, you know, X touring band with one album comes and you're jumping up on stage and all this shit. Okay, it is kind of perceived as a danger for people to come up on stage. It's horrible that we live in a world now where bands perceive that as a threat. But, you know, when somebody walks up on stage and kills a legendary guitarist right there in front of everybody, there are certain security precautions that have to be taken, you know, to prevent that sort of tragedy from ever happening again.
I believe Aaron Lewis gave the exact same explanation with a different set of words.
That was me with Aaron Lewis.
So show and tell continues. Yeah, it's like, you know, this isn't video, right? This guy came up, he gave Randy a hug. Randy's like, okay, whatever. He throws the guy off the stage, and they keep playing. Well, then immediately after that, see, when you are up on stage and the lead singer of a band pushes you off the stage, that delivers a certain type of message of saying, hey guys, I don't want anybody on the fucking stage. Well, another guy jumps up on stage. Randy essentially does the exact same thing. Pushes the dude backwards off the stage. One problem. Dude falls backward off the stage, hits his head, has brain hemorrhaging, dies a few days later in the hospital after being in a coma. But here's the thing: if you're Randy Blythe, you just push some idiot off the stage, you finish your show, you go home. That's it. He didn't know anything was going on, and so they continue on with their daily lives. They go home. They start working on their next album, which is 2012's Resolution, and we will pick up what happens with this whole Prague incident after we talk about that album.
I liked this record, but the thing that's interesting about it to me is this is when Randy really took to Instagram, so much so that I remember him and I making reference to Swayze Week that we were talking, because he was obsessed with Patrick Swayze for some reason. I think it was when he got into surfing, so he was talking about like Roadhouse and Point Break and all that kind of stuff, and we were talking about weird Patrick Swayze Point Break riding surfboard inspired tattoos and so forth. But all that aside, I remember the band recording this on a remote island, and just a lot of like, I think it was this record, and then Randy just kind of being very, you know, this is like the tranquil Randy. I'm growing my dreads Randy. And sometimes I wonder, when a metal band gets to this part of their career where, you know, they got money, and before the events of what you just said are about to happen to the band financially. But I wonder if this is a record where, you know, you're what, 6, 1, 2, 3,
This is album 7.
Okay, album 7. You're 7 albums in. You're over a decade into your career. That this isn't the layup record. I feel like this is a layup from the band. It's got everything we want. It's going to appease fans, new and old. But there's nothing that's pushing it, not like it was when Sacrament came out, where you're like, wow, this band's really going down some new, interesting territories. To me, this is basically Wrath Part 2.
You showed up at your job.
Yeah.
And you clocked in. You did your job. Nobody can really complain about your work performance. But you didn't wake up that morning being like, holy shit, I'm going to get so much done at work today. This was, okay, well, it's been 3 years. I guess we need to put something out, you know. All right, guys, what do you guys got? Well, you know, this is pretty cool. Oh, yeah, I like the groove on that. Yeah, I like, man, what's this one called? Oh, this is Straight for the Sun. This is like a really slow, you know, almost doom metal, like really slow track. I'm going to throw some brutal vocals over it, you know, really get people in the mood for what Lamb of God's all about, you know. And we're basically just going to do the same shit we've been doing since 2006.
Anybody got a problem with that?
Nobody had a problem with that.
Damn right we didn't.
Well, I mean, it's like I was saying, too, though. I think this is, at their quote-unquote kind of worst, they're still better than almost everyone at their best.
They're a professional band with a budget, a good studio, and good ideas. but that definitely doesn't have the immediacy that the band used to have. And a very similar thing happened to Mudvayne later on in their career. You know what I mean? Like, no, I'm not saying that it's as bad as what Mudvayne put out, but what I am saying is that, like, it's a slower. We're in the more laid back Lamb of God now, and that's where we're gonna be. We're never going back to As the Palaces Burn. We're not even going back to Ashes of the Wake. We're not really even going back to Sacrament, which, despite being a stylistic change, was still just as aggressive and just as ballsy and straight ahead as, as Ashes of the Wake that came before it. They were just kind of changing direction a little bit. But it's kind of one of those things where, like, 6 years ago, you guys did something really cool and new, but you're doing it again in 2012, but it's not new anymore. It might still be cool, but it's not pushing. And I don't think a band 7 albums into their career has to be innovative. They're certainly not obligated to redefine metal every time they fucking put a record out. Nobody can live up to that expectation. Gojira can live up to that expectation, but not very many. But eventually, in 10 years, we might be sitting here and being like, oh, fuck, it's another Gojira album. Nothing wrong with it, but, or maybe not. I don't know. But what I am saying is that, like, yes, they could be innovative, but they don't have to be. And if your expectation is for a band that's been around since 1999 in 2012 to still be as immediate and interesting as they were back in the early 2000s, it's a pipe dream. So, yeah, I'm not going to run out. I'm not going to buy Resolution. I'm going to stream it on Spotify. Or I'm going to, it's not really a record that I'm going to just sit there and listen to until I get it. It's just like, yeah, it's pretty cool. There's a couple of bangers on there, but it's not like, they're not like the bangers of yesteryear. They're just kind of okay. If you're a hardcore Lamb of God junkie, you're going to like this record just like you've liked the last 3. You're not going to have any issues with it. And that's all I really have to say about Resolution. It's not really like, it probably sold plenty of copies, but you're not widening your audience at this point. You're just on a plateau. You've reached the level of success that you're going to reach. And I wholeheartily believe that. I don't think that Lamb of God is going to suddenly become a household name again, or, be, super important as far as, like, innovative stuff goes, But, what if they fucking sold out and put out a deathcore record after that? Like, that wouldn't be a good move either. So, like, what do you really expect the band to do? They're going to show up for work. They're going to do their job, and you're going to be fine with it. And for the most part, I was fine with it, but it's not a record that I'm going to be returning to very often. If I want to hear a Lamb of God record that sounds like Resolution, I'm going to go listen to Sacrament, dude. I'm not even going to listen to Wrath. I'm going to listen to Sacrament every time. Let's get back to the more interesting shit that took place in 2012.
I feel like this is the only reason you asked me to come on.
Oh, you know it. True crime. Metal true crime.
The Metal podcast.
There is, so they go back to Prague. Kind of a bad move. They didn't know it was a bad move. But pretty much after they're well into this tour overseas, and Randy gets arrested. I'd like to imagine as soon as they stepped into the city limits, he was immediately taken into custody.
So you've not read the book?
No.
What about you, Joe?
I'm just imagining that that's what happened because that's more entertaining.
Educate us, Uncle John.
All right. So in the book Dark Days, a memoir by D. Randall Blythe, he recounts. It's basically is about him going to prison and the trial and everything leading up to it and the after events. Basically, the band were going back to Prague to play some makeup shows, if I'm not mistaken. But basically, the band got off the plane, went through the terminal, and then they were detained. They didn't know why, and in the book, Randy, I think, even says, like, oh, he thought maybe someone was trying to sneak on some, like, weed or something, and they got popped for it.
Something stupid, yeah.
Something stupid. But then some, like, KBG-type motherfuckers come in with, like, assault rifles and shit and ask him to come with them, and he's still not sure as to why, and then basically they're asking him about, is he aware that there is a warrant out for his arrest for manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter? And he's like, no.
It's got to be some other Randy Blythe. Yeah, like...
Well, apparently, I mean, just like anybody who knows somewhat anything about our judicial system here in the States or whatever, but like typically, like if you're wanted for something or there's a warrant out for your arrest, you get some sort of news or a letter or something stating the fact.
A postcard from Prague that's like, hey, by the way, you're wanted for manslaughter. Yeah.
And apparently they had reached out to the American embassy or whatever, and no one relayed any information, and they hauled him away right then and there. Took him to jail for manslaughter. He had no clue. They're asking him questions in a foreign language, basically, and asking him to recall events from 2.5 years before, where, just like you said earlier, where it's like you're playing a normal show, one of hundreds that you're playing that year. Hey, can you recall what you did that night that was different, since you're probably playing a completely different set list and you're in a different town and all that? It's like, no.
I've played 1,500 shows since then. It's like,
Yeah. So the book is really interesting in the sense that, for as much as you would think that he would kind of just be very, well, fuck this place and, blah, 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 blah. It's really interesting to see how he just kind of accepted it so quickly. Like, all right, like, this is what I have to do and this is what I'm going through and I'm going to be here. And even to the point of when he was released all that time later, that, most people would have assumed, and I probably would have done this, if you release me, I'm probably not going to come back. even if you try to
hopping on a plane and going home, and unless you're going to send Batman to get me, it's not happening. I'm going to go back to my own country where I'm going to be protected.
Yeah.
And it's not going to matter. So this is a testament to like somebody's character. We talked a lot on the Tim Lambesis thing about a person's character. Lack of character, or if they have a lack of character or whatever. But in this case, what Randy did was very interesting in that they're like, okay, you're wanted for this. Eventually they brought him up to speed on why he was being detained, and why this is such a big deal. Like, why they were setting bail for him that was like way, like, his bail, I think his first bail was like $200,000.
And then they paid it right away.
And then they're like, no, wait. It's actually, it's $400,000.
And then they paid it.
And it was just like, shit, I don't remember what happened after that. Did they raise it again?
They raised it again and then basically said that even if they pay it, they're still going to detain him because they still need to process him or something to that effect.
Yeah. So it's like one of the, because they were sure he was a flight risk.
Yes.
Because like me and John were saying, like, I mean, I don't know if I would have, like, as soon as I had access to leave, I don't know if I would have stuck around. Just because of how uncomfortable the situation had to have been for him. Like, again, he's not at home. He's being asked questions by people not in his primary language
about shit that you're not even remembering because you don't know.
Yeah, we played a show and this and this and this. I mean, I guess if you go back and look at our itinerary from then, I guess we did. Like it wasn't a big deal. And so what ended up happening was this trial where they brought in experts. Like they brought in like people that like psychologically evaluated Randy to see if he was the kind of person that would kill somebody. It's really weird. Like why would he have picked this one show to be like, tonight's the night I'm gonna fucking kill somebody? Like totally not. It's like whatever the opposite of premeditated is. Like just a random act of violence. And go ahead, John. You know more about this than I do.
Well, as I say, the two things that were interesting to me in reading the book And I highly recommend, again, anyone who goes through that's interested in any of this or is a fan of Lamb of God, go get that book. It's quite thick and intimidating, but that sounded dirty. But it is it's a very good read, and there's a lot of very interesting things as a metal fan that are in it. And one of the things I wanted to bring up, the reason actually he remembered that show was because of getting a call about Paul Gray dying from Slipknot.
Oh, yeah.
Like that happened like that same night, I believe, or the day before. Either way, he was like, he remembered reading a text and hearing that Paul Gray had passed away. But the other interesting thing too about all of that to me was just the fact that, like you said, Randy didn't fault anybody. It pretty much had come out that he didn't push anybody, so he hadn't, and that's ultimately why he was able to quote unquote get off. Because he literally had no hand in the situation. But the fact that, I think, for me, how much more human Randy became, and like we have been saying the last couple minutes about his character coming to light and shining through in all of this, I think for anyone who maybe was a casual Lamb of God fan at best, I think because of the importance of what this meant for our scene and what it meant for, I guess if you want to go like wrestling kind of terms, heel versus face, like USA and all that kind of stuff, I think this really humanized Lamb of God in a way that they couldn't have done. I think it expressed different emotions that the band wouldn't have been able to put forth into music currently. And it's really interesting to have seen and to think back about when this happened, to what it allowed, to the success and the level it took the band because of this.
Well, I want to jump in quickly. Yeah. I was of the impression that they did prove that Randy did, in fact, push the fan. Now, this is, I haven't read the book, but according to the research that I did online, from what I understand is that he was found guilty of actually pushing the fan off the stage. But because, really, you have no real control, like, really, it's really just a horrible accident.
Totally.
That took place. They said that basically they came to the conclusion that morally he is responsible for the death of that person. But because they couldn't prove any sort of criminal intent,
negligence
or violation, and really what they ended up blaming it on more than anybody was the security at the show, because in Lamb of God's contract with anywhere where they tour, there are certain security concerns that they spell out in their contract that say, like, you need to have barriers this far from the stage, or you need to make sure that nobody's able to access the stage who could potentially come in contact with or hurt a band member. Because, and maybe it's not necessarily due to safety, but almost more due just to, like, we don't want to affect the performance by having all this stuff going on, that we don't know about. And so I think, them just kind of being chill guys weren't like huge sticklers for the security, but it was still the venue's responsibility to provide the level of security that was spelled out by the band in their contract. Because it is significant that a crowd surfer or stage diver that was not the victim was able to access the stage not once but 2 times, prior to the incident. And then this third guy gets up there and Randy does what he did with the first guy and pushes him off the stage, sends a very clear message that, hey man, this is not where you're supposed to be. And unfortunately, it's one of those shitty situations where dude just fell wrong. You would almost expect the lead singer of a metal band, like an aggressive metal band, to just be like, fuck this, these charges are fucking bullshit, this is all, this is just ridiculous, and just to trash.
This is my stage, you have no business being up here.
Well, it's okay if he feels like that, because that's, the truth. But, I think, again, talking about his character, he didn't really do that. He was very attentive to the whole process. I'm sure he was frustrated personally, like very frustrated with it on a personal level, but like that didn't come through in his interviews. I mean, he maintained his innocence, like, you know, but it was always one of those like, this is not something that I did, or, you know, I didn't murder someone, or, you know, it's not like a, you know, it's not a cut and dry thing. It's like, I don't think that I am personally responsible, but I'm sorry that this happened. You know, was kind of his maintained stance throughout the whole thing. And that's about it. I mean, I know you guys are looking for something really juicy, but eventually, you know, cooler heads prevailed and they realized that they didn't really have a case, you know.
I think the thing that was crazy to me, and especially in reading the book, was just how not of a bigger story this was in our U.S. news system. Yeah.
I remember when I was trying to find news about it, a lot of it was only on like European websites.
Yeah. It was very weird. Like, I mean, in today's world where everything is news, even anything political, social, whatever, especially, it still was kind of shocking to see how little this made outside of like the PRP. Like, I mean, if you looked at like the literal hundreds of thousands of comments, shares, likes, whatever on social media and such about this thing, you would think that it would have created a groundswell of like an uprising. And it was weird to like talk to someone about it, you know, amongst other political things going on globally, and people were just kind of like, wait, what's going on? I'm like, oh, this guy from this band. I'm like, oh, I've never heard of that band, don't know anything about that. And it's like, huh, that's really weird.
Well, like you said, John, how this potentially affects our scene. I mean, there was a lot of really important ground covered, you know, in that trial, in that, like, it seemed like to the people in Prague, or, you know, at least in their justice system, that, like, they were, like, kind of like, well, what do you mean he didn't do it on purpose? Look at him. Here he is on stage, thrashing, playing this angry music, looking angry, looking pissed off. And, like, people had to, like, sit them down and, like, show them heavy metal videos and, like, show them, like, Lamb of God videos and stuff. They're like, what Randy was doing at this show is part of the show.
Right.
It's not that, like, he is this... It's not like he's actually this big, scary dude, you know, that's, like, out to just, you know, kill people and, you know, and murder people's faces and all this shit. Like, it's all part of the show. Like, it speaks to this idea of, like, people just automatically assuming that since it's metal and it's heavy, that it's somehow, like, linked in any way to violent behavior or linked to, you know, to murder or devil worship or what, you know, whatever. You know, to be honest with you, I'm surprised that didn't come up at some point in the career, like the band, or
Burn the Priest.
Yeah, like the band's stance on religion, or the, you know, like all that stuff. You know. Even I don't consider Lamb of God to be like a straight up like satanic metal band. They're really just a metal band, you know, that has opinions about things. But like, I'm surprised that didn't come up. But like, yeah, the implications of, like, you know, in 2012 in America, you wouldn't have necessarily seen that type of reception to like the fact that the band's overall sound was called into question is like some sort of confirmation of the act is kind of ridiculous to me, but it does kind of just show that, like, there are still people that aren't really aware that, like, this, like, really seriously aggressive music exists, but it's still made by, like, normal people like you or I. You know, it's just a style of music that they appreciate and decided that that's what they wanted to play. It wasn't because they were, like, all bad dudes that wanted to make bad music. You know, like, I don't know. Like, I'm not really sure where I'm going with it, but, like, it's just one of those things where it's shocking to me that was even a consideration.
I think what you're hitting on is, if it was in America, that would have been all of the focus, because that's all anybody ever focuses on. Anytime anything bad happens, that's all anybody focuses on. But in a completely different country, it became about just that one person.
Right.
And that is odd, considering how heavy music has been treated in the past.
Well, yeah, you look in America, like, and I'm only going to bring this up one more time and then we're done. But like with the Tim Lambesis thing, I remember reading article titles and stuff like, lead singer of heavy metal band or growling vocalist arrested as, you know what I mean? Like I remember reading those headlines. A lot like the metal websites weren't saying that, but like your general Dallas Star or whatever is reporting.
I think a better example would have been the Judas Priest court cases.
Yeah, the Judas Priest court case, or even like the Twisted Sister,
where somebody killed
stuff.
themselves, and we know it's your fault, and then we can't prove it.
Right. Well, D. Snyder took care of all that for us.
As I say, the interesting thing too, and even because my timeline might be slightly skewed, but wasn't this also around the same time of the Ian Watkins thing?
Yeah, pretty close.
And like that didn't even make news.
There's people that listen to Lost Prophets that don't even know about that.
But I wonder if it was because he wasn't a U.S. The band's not from the U.S.
Possible. Entirely possible.
Never really kind of thought about that until just now.
But this has been another episode of Heavy Metal True Crime. And now, back to discography discussion.
So, let's get into 7, Sturm und Drag.
Guys, technically it's your 8th album, but whatever.
No, that's the interesting thing, like I was saying earlier, about how the band, seemingly, by album title standards, doesn't count Burn the Priest as a thing.
But then they come back as Burn the Priest in 2018. Anyway, okay.
I just wonder, well, I guess maybe we can unravel that.
I don't know later. If I can. But this record actually had some genuine angst on it.
Yeah, go figure.
Yeah. Totally founded, this record I felt was much stronger musically, lyrically than any, like it wasn't a return to, As the Palaces Burn, but it was the heaviest version, I feel like, of the newer era of Lamb of God. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a return to form, but it's definitely more like if you liked Sacrament, you'd like this. This would be kind of a step forward. You just had those two albums in there in between that didn't step forward, and now we're ready to get off the fucking pot, like.
This definitely seems like the record that should have followed Sacrament.
Absolutely. And for a lot of people, that is, kind of what it was. It's really, I'm really happy too to see that they came back after the trial and everything, because that whole experience just drained the band down to like nothing financially.
Sure did.
It was rough because they had come off of basically being a really big successful band. I don't think any of the band members were like millionaires, but they were doing really well for themselves being a heavy band.
I think they were at that As Lay Dying level, if not a little bit bigger.
I think less.
You think less, honestly?
I think less, yeah.
Yeah, I don't think Lamb of God has ever been the top tier in anyone's book.
Well, anyone with ears. But no. They fucking should be. But yeah, like...
ladies and gentlemen, unpleasable metal fan.
Right. But no, I mean, I think As Lay Dying was actually bigger. We're done talking about them, goddammit.
It's interesting to me that you think As Lay Dying was bigger, because whenever I saw them, Lamb of God was always playing bigger shows, bigger arenas and such than As Lay Dying ever did at their peak.
I'm going to say at best they were on the same level. I can't say more. Now, who lost?
As Lay Dying never headlined Ozfest.
Here's the big question. Who lost more money in a trial?
Oh, Lamb of God, hands down.
Absolutely. Well, they lost all their money.
I mean, they had to start auctioning shit off to pay for Randy's things.
Yeah, I mean, Tim just lost his stuff.
His parents are rich.
Yeah, good call.
So, what I remember about this album title, actually, is that Randy and Mark liked the Word version of this album title. And it was Willie and Chris, go figure, and John that were more into just calling it by the album number. So then they compromised and came up with this obnoxious title. Dan, your thoughts on that?
What? No, I'm trying to think of a nice way to say it. I just thought it was dumb. Should have just called it Storm and Stress.
Fair enough.
My opinion.
I kind of wondered how much of it was trying to play into the whole prog-y kind of thing. People would probably associate it with, being in the Czech Republic and so forth.
It's possible. I mean, it's probably the right call, but like if I was making that same call, I would have just called it Storm and Stress. But
what if they just called it like Randy's out?
Randy's out, bitches. Yeah. I'd have bought that record. 100%. But no, like getting back to the music on this record, I thought this was a heavier Lamb of God. I thought at least heavier than we'd had in a while.
Focused.
Yeah, and I thought the track with Chino on it was really cool. Not expecting that whatsoever. That one really threw me for a loop.
Can I pause you for just a second there? Were you potentially like me and wondering if you're getting Chino like he ends up being on everyone else's shit, or if we're gonna get Whitechapel Chino guest vocal appearance?
Yeah, I wasn't sure. I mean, I wasn't looking at the track listing when I was listening to it, and so it came completely out of as a surprise to me. But it was definitely like because at first I was like, holy shit, that sounds just like Chino, and then I looked at it, I was like, okay, so that's Chino. Okay,
if it looks like Chino and it sounds like Chino and it smells like
Chino.
Well,
no, but if he had been like coming at it like real aggressive, I might not have noticed it right away. Whereas heavy music sometimes tends to blend into the background when you're doing other stuff. But no, this was very noticeable. Like this is this was like the clouds parting kind, and Chino just ascends from heaven. Kind of vocal. So I appreciated that. I would have enjoyed hearing him do more of a aggressive guesting on it, but I thought it was cool and really kind of we've never heard anything like that on a Lamb of God record before.
No.
So that I thought that was really notable and kind of made really just not just necessarily that one song, but I think it really made the record stand out.
I was to say, given the fact that you guys just did the Dillinger Escape Plan thing, what did you think of the song with Greg?
Oh, I thought it was awesome, but I'm a huge Dillinger fan. Because again, I didn't really pay attention to this record when it came out, so this week was my first time with it. So I didn't get to dig into it, but I really enjoyed it, especially after slogging through the last two. I thought that this was really. I thought it was really well done. I thought Greg sounded great on his guest. What was that track called?
It's called Torches.
Torches, yeah. And
interestingly enough, Chino's is called Embers.
Yep. So shouldn't they have gone in opposite or never mind.
I agree.
Well, unless you used embers to create the torches. I mean, it is possible. There's a Zayo song called Ember. Everyone take a drink.
You gotta bleep it out like I did on my podcast.
Right. So yeah, I mean, I thought that was great. I mean, I'm not used to there really being guest vocalists on Lamb of God stuff.
It was definitely interesting.
Yeah, it was a different dynamic, and I think it'd be interesting to hear who else they can get for future releases. But yeah, this was definitely a huge step in the right direction. I think it kind of got the band back on their feet after suffering that huge financial blow.
Do you think potentially being in financial straits causes one's... I don't necessarily want to say takes you from being comfortable, but when you realize, man, we really got to come up with something.
Oh no, that's totally what it was.
Totally,
so? Yeah, and I won't believe any other explanation. To be honest, because that is absolutely your driving force. Think about how most bands' debut albums are so fucking good, with the exception of this band, but. You think about how a lot of people, they'll hear a band and it never got any better than the first album. Again, because when they wrote that album, they were nobody,
right?
And so they were proving themselves to the world. And I think in the case of Lamb of God, that's exactly what this was we've got to get out. We're in the clear now. We won the battle, but our whole city's burned down. So
it's a burn,
right? Yeah, they burned the palace and the priest, and it's one of those situations where they had to come up with something really brilliant, And I'm not going to necessarily say this is like really brilliant, but it is definitely a huge step in the right direction.
So you would say this is the band coming from the ashes of the wake?
Well, it has been a pleasure, John. No.
I know it's low hanging fruit. I can't help myself.
Yeah, it's fine. But,
hey, but you know what? We'll see them band, getting their wrath after the sacrament, and the resolution will be really good. We're no longer friends now. I get it.
I'm not even looking at the Skype window anymore. So
I say good day, sir.
Right. Didn't hear anything from Lamb of God after this for a while. Technically, we haven't heard anything from Lamb of God after this.
I would like to get both of your thoughts, though, real quick about Overlord. Because a lot of times on a lot of the past episodes you've done, something where a band really takes a left of center move. This is the first song that has clean singing on it.
Once in 20 years, I'll let you have one.
Did you enjoy it?
It was different.
I wouldn't mind hearing it again, to be honest.
Were you surprised at how decent Randy's voice actually is in a somewhat clean singing approach?
I remember thinking, fuck, who's the guest vocalist on this one? And then
Really?
I was like, yeah, but then, after looking it up, I was like, okay, that is Randy singing. Yeah, I was surprised, to be honest. Not sure why that wasn't busted out prior. But again, talking about character and, how metal somebody is or isn't or whatever, wouldn't have been appropriate, I don't think, on at least the first 4 records it wouldn't have been. Especially since, because if you were going to throw a melodic chorus or something like that into the old sound, for that you would need a Corey Taylor, or you know what I mean, to make it so high and flying. I'm not sure that he could comfortably deliver this in that context, but I think for a slower song, works perfectly.
Were you surprised at the breakneck, almost ruin-esque part in the song?
Yeah, that was you guys are still awake, right? Yeah, yeah, it was surprising. Again, I got a little bit of not a Dillinger vibe from that song, but more of just this was the first time I was listening to a Lamb of God song where I was like, shit, what are they going to do next? And I don't usually get that feeling, like within a song, in a very micro sense of I don't know where this song is going to go now. Because it already started off bananas for Lamb of God, But yeah, no, I thought this sounded really good. I liked that the song was still dynamic and still had heavy stuff in it. The band didn't release a ballad and lose their identity completely in it.
All that remains.
Yeah, fuck that band. But yeah, exactly.
This guy, I can't take him anywhere.
They really. I thought this was sincere. I don't think that they were trying to make any kind of pass for a single,
right?
On this. I don't think it was meant for that.
I think that's a more accurate description of how this album came to be. I don't think it had anything to do with financials. Yes, that is a motivator for most people, but Lamb of God is a band that never really lost their peak. They scored 97 and then dropped down to 92 and maybe hit an 88 in there, but they never really failed. So I don't think you would have gotten a different record had that not happened. This is just a sincere release.
I think if the trial had never happened and they were not financially viable, if they were still super well off, I think this record would have been boring as fuck.
I don't think so. They've consistently stepped it up, and then, they stepped back, but then they stepped it back up. This is just another step up from Resolution.
I think this is great. What I'm saying is that, if they didn't have this trauma, this drama that took place, I don't think that we would have had the type of conviction and sincerity in it as we got.
I definitely agree with that, because I definitely feel like the trial and the process, like I said, brought out a different side of Randy that most people probably hadn't seen. There are a lot of people who probably don't know how smart Randy really is, or Mark, or most of the people for that matter. And I think this, like I said, I think it humanized them to where potentially I wonder just how much of an effect this had on people, the band kind of going like, well, people like Randy, and not Randy for being the screamer, angry metal guy, but for being a person. And it just makes me wonder how much of that led to the growth we saw on this record.
So where do you think they're going to go now?
Interestingly enough, they put out an EP recently. And by recently, I mean like 2 years ago. But by typical standards, that's fairly recent. And I guess when you're supporting Slayer, who haven't done anything new in like 32 years, you're going to ride out that farewell tour for all it's worth to make some of that money back. But, really the EP, honestly, was 2 songs. The Duke, which was about a fan that Randy ended up befriending, I believe, in some way, shape, or form. And the person, I think, and I'm probably getting this wrong, but I think something to the effect of like the fan had like terminal cancer, and Randy and him ended up becoming friends. And the person ended up passing away, and the person's like nickname was the Duke. And so Randy wrote this song for his friend / a fan of the band. And then there was a song called The Culling, and then the rest was just basically live versions of stuff off of the last record. Although I think the weirdest thing was when this EP came out randomly, was the fact that one of them was 512 from Bonnaroo. And I was like, I didn't even realize Lamb of God played Bonnaroo. Like, if that isn't speaking to the level of like where you're at in the music scene, I don't really know what could. And Lamb of God at Coachella.
Well, so what do you think the decision was then to change the band's name? Maybe they didn't change the band's name, but they put out a covers album this year under the name Burn the Priest.
I think that's just a nod to the original fans that know the original band name, and it's a way of getting yourself out of the limelight so that none of your core Lamb of God fans will give you any shit.
I think Joe's partially right with that. I think what it is very much, like I said, a nod to Burn the Priest. But I think the whole point typically usually with a covers record at this point, whether you're going with Garage Inc., whether you're going with, any of the bands that have ever done covers records, typically the whole point is to show where your influences came from. So if we're going with influences, then obviously we need to go all the way back to when the band was the band initially, which is Burn the Priest. So they're doing covers of bands that have influenced them, but we have to take it all the way to the beginning, which is Burn the Priest. So it's almost like paying off your legacy. And that's what I think the whole reason behind the name change was. For a while, I almost wondered if it was more of a legal thing. Like, maybe they still owed someone an album, or this is a way to get out of a contract of some sort.
Yeah, because my understanding is they're not going to continue as Burn the Priest. This is just a one-off. The next record that comes out is going to be... The next record that comes out, though, is going to be Lamb of God. I mean, it has to be, I could be wrong about that.
How fucked up would it be if they went back to Burn the Priest all these years later?
Well, it's weird, too, because every time I... No. Every time I make a big statement like that on the show, the opposite ends up happening. So,
Jim Lambesis hasn't released a statement saying how sorry he is.
Oh,
that
here
actually
it is.
Already happened.
This band, the original lineup of this band is never going to get back together. Here's 30 minutes of why the original lineup of the band got back together with the band.
I'm still going to call this, and I'll put it on this because I've never said it on record anywhere. I say in the next 5 years, Chicago Open Air is going to get the original Smiths back together.
We will reconvene if that happens.
I mean, they got Misfits, and no one thought that was going to happen ever.
Fair enough. So, guys, final thoughts on Lamb of God.
Final thoughts on Lamb of God. Like a lot of bands of this era, they started off kind of rough, but showed a lot of premise. Sorry, wrong word. Showed a lot of promise. And eventually, through, I think, slagging it out with a lot of their contemporaries who maybe weren't in the same ilk, so piggybacking off of your kill switches and so forth of that thing put a little bit of a shine on the band that maybe they didn't deserve early on, but eventually the band was able to come through with their proficiency as musicians and as people, but always evolving it to where they would always gain new fans and it would keep people on their toes. As we were just saying, we're almost 20 years into a career and they're still doing things that we don't expect them to do. And if that doesn't allow them to continue being who they are while still appreciating who they have been and who they were, I don't think we would be talking about that band, because there's obviously no reason to talk about a band that can't evolve past the first thing they did that was somewhat good 20 years ago.
We already talked about Slayer.
They did one thing good once. That's like Al Bundy throwing 4 touchdowns in high school.
All I'm going to say about Lamb of God as a final thought is that their worst shit is better than your best shit. And that's how I've always felt about the band. Really, is that I always thought that they were doing something special. And I didn't always like it, but it was always something special. So that's all I got.
And I'm going to say that.
Sounds good. Big hand clap for Joe tonight, talking when he shouldn't have been at all. Well, I have no idea where Joe usually takes it from here.
Albums of the week.
Oh, yeah.
So, John, what's your album of the week?
These are 2 albums I've listened to very equally. And they're on completely different broad spectrums of the musical spectrum. I say that a lot. I've been really enjoying The Carters, the Beyonce Jay-Z EP that just dropped. It's really fucking good. And it's the perfect end to the trilogy that basically is Beyonce's Lemonade, Jay-Z's 444, and now this. I think it really encapsulates the whole a relationship as far as being a married couple and all the stresses that come from it, and cheating and reconciliation and all that from both female and male perspectives, into being a stronger couple as a result of it, and just shitting on basically everyone who wanted to shit on you and take shots at you while you supposedly were weak. It's a great record. I think Ape Shit is a great video and a great single. And there's lots of good stuff on that record, lyrically and so forth. And the other one, after making some jokes earlier this week with Dan, has been See You Next Tuesday's Intervals. Like I said, Fox is a friend of mine. He's tattooed me a handful of times. I took him to the first date of that tour, and we listened to the record before it came out when they were starting their tour with I Wrestled a Bear Once. And I remember hearing the song January and On and just being like, holy fuck, dude, like this is on some, like, this is going to take your band further in your band's career, because like you can only do grind for so long, but when you start making interesting songs like this, I think it's going to take you further. And for a fun bonus points thing, if you're ever at a bar that has touch tunes and you can find that song on touch tunes or AMI, play it, because there's about 5.5 minutes worth of a clock ticking at the end of it that'll drive any bar patron upset outside of the music itself.
Dan, what about you?
I've been listening to the album False by the band Gorefest.
Foreshadowing?
Maybe. By the way, I also want to do a shout out to all of the participants in the Discography Discussion official Facebook group. It has been awesome seeing that group kind of bloom and see people posting things in there every day, and it's definitely a fun thing for me to return to have everybody in the same room and be able to shoot ideas off of, and we can talk about what music we're talking about, and people have been making requests that I'm going to have to put in an Excel spreadsheet and follow up on. So that group's been really cool, and we really appreciate everybody that's participated in it.
And if Joe's record isn't Snot, that's a horrible missed opportunity.
Well, since you mentioned it, I've been listening to Stranger Fruit by Zeal and Ardor. I have a very strange coworker that walked up to me and said, "Do you like black metal?" "Yes." "Do you like old Southern African spirituals?" "Yes." "You need to listen to Zeal and Ardor. It's not what you're expecting." And he was right.
So based off of the brief questionnaire at the beginning, how would it not be what you're expecting if you asked those two questions?
Have you heard it, John?
No, I have not.
You need to listen to
We'll
it.
talk here in about 5 minutes after I do this outro.
Shh. Let it happen.
Just let it happen, man. Let it be what it is. And on that note, this has been episode 71 of Discography Discussion. Thank you for listening. You can like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at discussmetal. Subscribe to our podcast everywhere you listen to podcasts, including Google Play, iTunes, and Stitcher. Visit discussmetal.com for all things discography discussion, and please send questions and comments to danandjoeshow@gmail.com. If you are not a patron, you can become one at patreon.com/discussmetal. We have some sweet perks.
Give me your money.
$1 gets you into that exclusive album review feed and other cool things. Jons Untitled podcast can be found on Facebook, SoundCloud, and everywhere you listen to podcasts.
Except for Google Play.
We'll talk later.
Not everything seems clear, the future's not so bright. The only chance is not to waste your life. Have hope and have no fear, the truth walks by your side.